Welcome to the Security News, episode 218 for the week of June 19th, 2022. I'm Jason Wood. I'm covering for Dr. Doug this week while he does some yodeling in the mountains of Switzerland. This week we've got Linux botnets, misconfigured AWS buckets, 24.6 billion credentials for sale, forced updates of WordPress plugins, and more fun with Elon Musk. All this and more on this episode of Security Weekly News.
This is Security Weekly, for security professionals, by security professionals.
We interrupt our program to bring you this important message.
It's the show that keeps you up to date on the latest security news twice a week. Your trusted source for accurate security information and expert analysis. It's time for Security Weekly News. Monitoring and maintaining compliance is a never-ending struggle with a high price of failure. Firemon helps customers meet complex and varying compliance requirements. Firemon has fully customizable reporting, analytics, assessments, and dashboards to meet the compliance needs of any organization. With Firemon, compliance reports take a tenth of the time, and real-time continuous compliance eliminates the anxiety and headaches of audit preparation. Improve security outcomes by improving security operations with Firemon. Visit securityweekly.com/Firemon to learn more.
Right now, everybody is talking about cryptocurrency, and the cyber criminals are hiding in the conversation. Cyber criminals use social engineering loaded with urgency and fear to successfully prey on your company, your employees, and your customers. Spear phishing is just one of the 13 types of email threats. Barracuda has identified 13 types and shows you how you can protect your company, your customers, and your reputation. Find out about the 13 email threat types and Barracuda email protection by going and getting your free ebook at securityweekly.com/Barracuda. That's securityweekly.com/Barracuda.
Hey everybody, welcome again to this week's news. Doug will be back with us next week, but I'm standing in for him this time around. So let's go ahead and just get started and dive into it with the Panchan, something like that, malware that is spreading across Linux hosts. Akamai researchers describe Panchan as a peer-to-peer botnet and a Linux worm. Basically, the self-spreading nature of the malware is the part that's actually kind of interesting. It gets to the host, logs in via really a couple of different ways where it tries to get to the other host via SSH. One is via brute force, SSH login attack. The other is to use SSH keys on a host that it is already compromised. Now, obviously, the brute force SSH key attack, that's not terribly interesting. Anybody who has ever stood up a host using SSH and left it on port 22 on the internet sees lots and lots of different login attempts. But the SSH key bit of the attack is actually kind of clever. Essentially what happens is the malware gets onto the system and it starts checking the home directories that it has access to for SSH keys on the host, and then what hosts are in the authorized or the known host file inside of the .ssh directory of these accounts. After all, it makes fairly good sense. If we got SSH keys here and we've got an entry in the known host file, sooner or later we're going to get a combination of hosts and keys are going to match up, and sure enough, then the malware logs into another host and continues the spread from there. So that's kind of an interesting twist on that. I mean, you got the two bits of information you'd need there to dive in and pivot to another host. It can happen very fast since this is completely automated. Doesn't depend on any human to run. This is just self-propagating. Once it gets on a new host, it goes through the process again of looking at the SSH configuration, but it also will make an HTTPS post request to a Discord webhook, probably to just check in with whoever is running this botnet and carry out whatever commands they want it to. Then it starts doing crypto mining. And in this case, to load up XMRig or another miner named NB hash. One interesting aspect of this is because to avoid writing things to disk, it actually creates a memory map file, so it doesn't hit the file system. It just stays in memory. So trying to get around a little bit of the analysis there that could take place by defenders. And since the crypto mining is such a subtle thing on process utilization on the hosts. The malware or the worm actually tries to do a little bit of hiding and try and keep itself on the host. Essentially, what it's going to do, it's going to ignore signals to stop executing, like SIGTERM and others. The only one that it can't ignore because of the POSIX architecture is SIGKILL. So that one will actually stop it, but the other signals it will go ahead and ignore. And it also continually watches for the top command or the HTOP command. And if it sees either one of them, it terminates the minor processes. So you won't see the processes using the CPU, the high CPU utilization there. Now, I assume, though the Akamai blog post doesn't say it, that when top or HTOP quit, then the process, the parent process for the malware sees this and then spins up the mining software again. So, the blog post contains a bit more information about the malware itself. If that's interesting to you and you want to get some more details, go ahead and take a look at the show notes. Staying on the malware theme for a bit, ZDNet reports that a phone wiping banking Trojan for Android devices has just gotten a bit nastier with us. The Brata, B-R-A-T-A malware has received an update that allows the application to basically intercept SMS authentication codes, use that to turn around and log into accounts that, again, require that SMS second factor authentication there, and it has improved its ability to phish for banking credentials. Brata stands for the Brazilian Remote Access Tool Android. But apparently, it apparently has been around since 2019. It got its name because in the beginning it targeted Brazilian banks primarily, but now it has become much more cosmopolitan and has gone onto the international scene in Europe where it's targeting banks there. The new update is spreading via SMS messages, pretending to be the bank that's targeted, saying, hey, you need to do something or other, click on this. You click on the link, and if you're on an Android device, it will basically install Brata, which then goes to work on the device. Now, the malware itself has a rather destructive bent because once somebody falls for the scam and a wire transfer is initiated, or when it detects that any kind of security tooling is possibly analyzing or trying to profile what's going on, it just hits the factory reset commands built into the phone and wipes the device entirely, leaving the victim basically to recover from backup. So a nasty bit of work there. On a more human-driven bit of crime, the 2019 breach of Capital One data has finally resulted in a conviction. In the intrusion itself, basically the information of over 100 million credit card applications in the U.S. and Canada were basically discovered and accessed from, you'll never guess, misconfigured S3 buckets set up there where anybody could access them. Capital One was actually notified of the issue with their AWS configuration via an email to their disclosure email address saying, hey, I think you got a problem on somebody's GitHub gist site. And they included the link to that and had data leaking. And so Capital One followed up on it and found that, oops, yep, that was actually legit. As they looked at the content of the gist, they found a list of 700 S3 buckets with their data in it. This contained everything anybody needed to open up a credit card account. So lots of potential for identity theft and things like that. According to the U.S. Attorney's Office, Paige Thompson is the individual who was scanning for AWS accounts that had S3 misconfigurations and looking for data to access. And the GIST account apparently linked directly to, was her GIST account profile. So I read through the criminal complaint. Basically, she was able to access data from over 30 different companies, which included Capital One. Now, as I read through it, it didn't indicate that Thompson was making attempts to sell the data or anything like that. But it did sound like she was planning on using it as kind of a docs type of thing and just publicly pushing the information out there, which is one of the things that they were obviously concerned about. Thompson didn't seem to be terribly concerned with OPSEC. If you read through the criminal complaint, which you can find from the link in the show notes, there was lots of references to who she was, and she was talking about this. So basically, she was arrested back in July 2019. Finally, we have the conviction now in the and she is scheduled for sentencing in September of 2022. As for Capital One, this was an extremely expensive S3 misconfiguration. The bank was fined $80 million for breach of data, and then it settled customer lawsuits to the tune of $190 million for a grand total of $270 million. So I'm sure somebody enjoyed having that missaid. Next up, according to the Digital Shadows research team, there are currently 24.6 billion, with a B, usernames and passwords for sale on the dark web in 2021. Now, of these credentials, 6.7 billion of them were actually unique. This represented, according to the researchers, a 34% increase over 2020, or roughly 1.7 billion more unique credential pairs. The use of these credentials is varied, though the Digital Shadows team seemed to place particular attention on account takeovers as a primary action being taken by those who finally ended up with these credentials. Now, I can't help but also wonder about not only account takeover or how you want to split, account takeover, but I see a lot of e-crime intrusions where these ransomware groups and stuff like that just show up over RDP or VPN with valid credentials, likely purchased through things like this. And then they start using that to carry out their actions on the host. So this is something that is definitely out there and works really well for our criminal threat actors. This next story is more funny than anything, I'll be honest. Rather than any serious impact. Apparently, the Indian government has issued last week a new security guidelines to the 30 million people who work for it. Now, kind of the funny part here is the measures include a requirement not to upload internal, restricted, or confidential government data to file sharing services. And then in the hilarious twist of this, the document is marked as restricted, meaning don't upload this anywhere. It's not supposed to go out to the public, right? And then it was immediately shared on an Indian government website. So yeah, that didn't work out terribly well. The document itself really isn't terribly interesting other than giving some insights into what the Indian government is requiring users to comply with, prohibiting the use of third-party DNS, using third-party VPNs or Tor or anything like that to hide where you're at, sending out any sensitive data over social media, unauthorized remote admin tools, which we see a lot of threat actors take advantage of, and also using third-party video conferencing tools that aren't authorized by the Indian government. And they actually get a little explicit on here is the DNS server you need to use, which is the national DNS server for India. But I think this is just for the government devices and accounts. While the document is not terribly exciting and contains stuff that we would all sit there and say, well, yeah, that makes sense. It was still funny to see something labeled as restricted and yet immediately shared publicly. Well, we can't seem to have an episode of Security Weekly News without at least one mention of ransomware, and this is that moment. Users of QNAP NAS devices are again being targeted by operators of the Deadbolt ransomware and are having their devices locked up. The article contains basically a screenshot of the ransom note, basically calling out QNAP for having poor security, and states that, don't worry, this is not a personal attack on you. We're just going after QNAP because they have poor security controls and coding practices and things like that. This rings just a little bit hollow to me because, it's like walking out of a store and having somebody walk up and smack you across the shins with a hockey stick and then tell you, Hey, it wasn't personal. It's just the store has bad security practices. They don't have good security guards hanging around. So, yeah, it would feel really personal to me, particularly since to unlock your data, you basically have to pay them 0.03 Bitcoin, which of last night equated to about $634 million. Or excuse me, $634. Goodness, I got too many millions on my mind. Anyhow, the victim might wait a week, and who knows, the price of Bitcoin, it'll drop to $400, or it might climb to $800. But, if you have any kind of device like this, don't put it on the internet. Basically, these devices are exposing the internet, and away they go. All right, next up is Ninja Forms WordPress plugin got hit with a Ninja Force update by the WordPress core team. Apparently, the plugin and the vulnerability in this plugin was deemed severe enough to force a silent, unnotified update of the plugin through WordPress core. The plugin is deployed on over 1 million WordPress sites and allowed code execution, deletion of files, things like that. Now, I've seen enough badly configured WordPress files. You look at the file deletion. It's like, well, it would only be with the web server process they'll be able to do that. But I've seen enough badly configured installations to know that somebody could get some great mileage out of this. Things are set up wrong all the time. The vulnerability requires no authentication to exploit. The blog post by Graham Cluley notes that website owners were a little bit surprised to see things being noted as updated, even though, hey, they had not enabled automatic updates. Honestly, I'm not going to pick on WordPress for doing a silent update like this, even though there is a little part of me that flinches at somebody else stepping around what I configured something to and executing code anyway. But WordPress has been trying for years to address their reputation for poor security, most of which derived through these plugins. And so, yeah, apparently they decided this was worth the extra effort here. And apparently, I couldn't resist even one more story about ransomware, though the crux of the article itself isn't about the ransomware itself. It's more about a technique that attackers could use to get around backups of data using services like SharePoint and OneDrive and Office 365's autosave features. Researchers from Proofpoint basically released this report that detailed two paths an attacker could take to prevent the recovery of auto-saved files, basically by changing or messing around, manipulating the data to take advantage of the maximum number of versions of files that will be synced to OneDrive or SharePoint. In their report, they state that IT organizations have kind of gotten a feeling of these services are safer than on-device type of storage, because we have this ability to, even if everything gets encrypted and it gets synced to OneDrive, we can just revert back to the previous version. So they took a look at this and were messing with this idea. And found that, hey, the researchers found this may not be the case. Essentially, the way this works, I'm sure you've probably all have seen this, but we have autosave, let's say, enabled in our Office applications, and if we're using something like Office 365 to sync to SharePoint or what have you, they're constantly being saved and pushed up to OneDrive or SharePoint. All of us have probably made the mistake. This derives from things like, oh crud, I was working on an untitled document for several hours and a power outage happened, or the program crashed or something like that, and I lost 4 hours worth of work. So, now I'm really angry. I learned early on in my career with computers, even before I was in IT, that Control S is my friend, and I should use it periodically. Autosave has probably saved countless hours of going back and redoing work due to lost documents. Anyhow, by default, this sync only allows for 500 versions of the files to be saved and kept inside of OneDrive and SharePoint. So if somebody reaches 501, then the first version of the file gets dropped from the list of files that can be restored, and it just kind of continues along with that. So what could an attacker do here? And this is really a kind of the hypothetical finding from the researchers. Basically, one idea is the malware operator or the ransomware operators could basically encrypt every file 501 times, giving them 500 versions of an encrypted file with no chance of recovering that data from previous versions. Now, the researchers note that in practical terms, this is extremely unlikely to occur in any kind of actual attack because it's going to take a long time to do all of this. And somebody may notice, and we could end up with this being stopped. Instead, there is a much easier path and one that doesn't even need admin access to do it. Users can control how many versions they want to sync to OneDrive or SharePoint. And so all we have to do, if I'm an attacker, is change that from 500 to 1 or something like that. Then encrypt the document maybe twice or something like that, and we're done, and we can move on. In the researcher's opinion, and in mine, this is going to be the much more likely method for the attack to occur. And they went on to explain how could this happen. Well, attackers get a hold of credentials using things like credential dumps to the tune of 24.6 billion of them up for sale, or 6.7 billion unique usernames and password combinations, and do an account takeover. And then they can just change the configuration of the file before their encryption and send it on its way. The researchers did contact Microsoft about this before releasing the report, and Microsoft looked it over and said, yep, that system is working as intended. Now, from reading the report, it does not sound like this is a technique being used in the wild yet. However, that could change. We've definitely seen ransomware operators change how they operate in response to different defenses. If they see, or feel like, hey, we're not getting as good a ransom payout as we would like because people are sending things to these file repository stores and they don't have, feel like they don't have to pay the ransom, I would guess that they will take the additional step of looking for this and then changing this version or the number of versions that they'll track so that they can get everything ransomed up and increase their return on investment, if you will. If that starts to happen, this is when I would expect somebody at Microsoft to take a little bit closer look at the issue and decide that maybe we need to do something. Now, Proofpoint did give some recommendations to help combat against this technique. Several of these were, links to services offered by Proofpoint. Leaving those aside, though, one of the recommendations seemed a little bit odd to me, given the scenario they laid out. Basically, they said, well, increase the number of restorable versions to something greater than 500 to protect, help increase the chance that you'll have things there to recover. If the ransomware is going ahead and encrypting just 501 times based on the default and not checking or anything like that, this would help in that scenario. But if they go in and take the other path, which is probably more likely, which is reset this down to something manageable like 1 version kept in the save or our history, then upping this count doesn't really mean anything because we'll just change it back during the attack. Still, they're trying to figure out some way of providing some kind of defense in a situation where there's really little available to defenders. They also are looking out for signs of account compromise, configuration changes occurring to people, to your cloud environment, Office 365 environment that may be risky to data integrity. Now, this one can be a bit of a tough one for defenders to deal with, as really when we start looking at creating alerts, there's a bias, particularly in SOCs. Hey, I only want a high fidelity alert that really indicates something bad is happening here, and in this case, you would have to make sure you figured out an alert for every possible bad thing that could happen inside of a cloud environment. That's kind of a difficult proposition. You could also, defenders may also create a pattern of detection changes or, alerts based on pattern of detections changes being made, and that can be challenging, again, being the large number of configuration options out there, but that at least casts a little bit wider net because we're looking for different types of patterns occurring. This is something I would take. This report is something I'd recommend taking a look at and reading. See what how does this apply to your environment? What would happen with your incident response process? How would your ransomware response process handle this type of scenario? And if it's would leave you in a bad, leave you stuck, basically, then this is something that we need to take a look at, making changes in our response plans. Like as they said, it doesn't appear to be in the wild right now, but that shouldn't take terrible much to change if the need ever popped up. And finally, with just a little bit of sarcasm, before we sign off for the day, in another chapter of the saga of Elon Musk supposedly purchasing Twitter, Elon has told Twitter employees that he's not necessarily going to enforce everyone to come back into work in the office. Now, he's doing that obviously at Tesla, at SpaceX, which made the news because he's forcing everybody to come back. But he did point out to Twitter employees that, Twitter is different than Tesla. We're not building cars, hard to build cars remotely. So he figures maybe some exceptions can be made for working from home. Ars Technica quotes Elon Musk as saying, quote, "The bias for me may be strongly towards working in person, but if somebody is exceptional, then remote work can be okay," end quote. So if the purchase ever goes through, and he did get approval today or from the board to go ahead with that, the board of Twitter to go ahead and do that, Twitter employees, unfortunately, are going to end up with a really, kind of a benchmark as to how the company feels about them. If they're a Twitter employee that is forced back into the office, obviously they aren't considered very exceptional, which is a really crappy way of handling employee evaluations. And with that, that is the news for the week of 19 June. I'll be back on Friday for the wrap-up of this week's news.